My name is Tanner Merlis, and I'm Associate Professor in the Program of Communication and Digital Media Studies in the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at Ontario Tech University in Oshawa, Ontario. Some of my current research focuses on the nexus of the alt-right, or white nationalism, and social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And I'm currently working with Dr. Barbara Perry, who is director of the Center for Hate, Bias, and Extremism, and we're conducting a study of white power music and YouTube.
So what is your sense for how certain movements are using YouTube to either influence or recruit followers?
Well, it's really interesting. When YouTube emerged in 2005, it was celebrated for enabling ordinary people to make money by making channels and videos. But white supremacists quickly learned how to become YouTube celebrities, and some are now making money on their own channels. So YouTube in general is used by white supremacists to communicate their ideology, amplify the profile of movement leaders, mainstream their hateful message, and engage and influence new recruits. Moreover, YouTube is enabling white supremacists to search for, play, view, comment on, like, and even share videos, which range from newsy interviews to update where the movement's at to white power music.
So give me a sense of what these videos could be like.
There's a wide range of genres, and these genres very much mimic what you would see on any mainstream news media channel or elsewhere. You can have, for example, interviews with movement leaders who will explain and try to rationalize their ideology. There'll be movements that are, or videos that are more like advertisements that are direct pitches or appeals to people to get involved. Some of these are music videos, which would feature, for example, white power bands, but even country music bands or folk bands that have now entered sort of the fray of white nationalist and white supremacist ideology. So using sort of YouTube, you're seeing a real mainstreaming or an attempt to normalize what in the past was of course seen to be and identified correctly as absolute hate speech.
Now, do any of these pieces or videos face any kind of a ban?
Yes, YouTube has its own community guidelines, which are essentially a set of user agreement sort of shaped guidelines that determine what YouTube users can and cannot do when using the video platform. So it's something akin to what we would look at as a media or a communications policy. So, for example, the broadcasters in Canada are governed by the Broadcasting Act, and they're to abide by certain regulations and codes regarding what sort of can and cannot be or should not be broadcast. So YouTube, however, is sort of operating outside of the framework of Canada's sort of sovereign communication and media policy and regulatory framework, and basically creating its own business-centric user guidelines to sort of govern the conduct of its users. So if users violate its community guidelines, or if users, for example, post content or videos that violates YouTube's own hate speech policy, YouTube can then take the content down, issue a warning to those users, or ban the users from the site.
Wow. Okay, but again, it's all based on a complaint system. Is that right?
Yeah, it's basically a complaint system whereby YouTube users themselves are sort of invited to responsibilize the problem of policing hate speech on the platform. So users themselves can flag videos, and then sort of YouTube will respond. At the same time, YouTube is developing algorithmic methods for trying to identify hate speech and take it down, sort of automating the sort of policing of hate speech. Also, there has been a push for Silicon Valley companies like YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter to hire content moderators, so actual workers involved in identifying and taking down content that violates the hate speech policies of these platforms.
Do you think these videos are targeted at the converted, or do you think it's beyond that?
I think it's beyond that. I think that on the one hand, you're going to have these videos attracting an existing audience of people that are entrenched with the sort of white supremacist and white nationalist hate ideology. They'll watch these videos, view these videos, share these videos to sort of reaffirm and reproduce that ideology. Well, at the same time, YouTube is a mainstream social media video sharing platform that reaches into the hearts and minds of billions of people all over the world. And so this is far, broader than just sort of reproducing the ideology of the converted. This is about reaching out and engaging new prospective recruits.
I think we can all say that there's been a growth in these groups. Do you think that platforms, social media platforms like YouTube, have fed that growth?
I wouldn't want to say that there's a direct causal relationship between the sort of definite empirical growth of white nationalist and white supremacist hate groups all over the world, because that would be quite a technologically deterministic argument that suggests technology is the prime mover, determinant of social change or any kind of social phenomenon that we could observe. But I would argue that social media platforms, video sharing sites like YouTube, have given existing white supremacists a very, very powerful medium to expand the reach of their message, to introduce their message to people that otherwise would not know about these groups and their ideology, and definitely to engage and strengthen that message. So it's not so much of a causal relationship, but it's definitely an influential sort of role that social media platforms are playing.
The other thing that I was wondering about, I mean, for years now, we've used this idea of the YouTube rabbit hole. And initially it was this funny concept where, you start watching a video and next thing it's 1 a.m. in the morning and you've watched 12 videos about unicorns,
Yes.
For no reason at all. So it used to be sort of this funny thing. But I don't know if you want to make any comments about that, whether the way that YouTube's algorithms or recommendation engine in some way might actually push people towards more extremist content or keep them engaged with more similar content.
Yes, I think that's a really pertinent observation. YouTube's business model and its sort of recommender algorithm arguably reproduces the ideology of white nationalism. So, YouTube relies upon an algorithmic recommendation system to expose its users to videos that it deems will be relevant to that user's preferences or interests based upon the data about the user it has gathered. For example, from a user's search history, viewing history, or the channel subscribed to, and even user click behavior. So by exposing users to white nationalist videos that it infers they will want to see, it may be reproducing their pre-existing ideological and political biases. In effect, many YouTube users interact in filter bubbles or echo chambers of sorts. So the more we search for, view, and click through white nationalist channels and videos, the more YouTube's algorithm will recommend and expose us to these. So it's this cycle of reproducing this awful hate ideology. And it was funny because, again, in 2006, 2007, this was seen about, personalization, customization, some sort of perfect cybernetic feedback loop between users and the content other users were uploading. But we can see how this algorithm, this business model can work to reproduce and amplify some of the worst ideological and hateful movements in the world today.
Makes such a good point, because it that was the big sell back then, is it's all personalized, it's content that is customized to what I want to see.
Much of my research focuses on the power of the U.S. With regard to the reach and influence of its communication technology, media companies, and entertainment. And so what we're seeing with social media is that U.S.-based hate movements and white supremacist movements are using these Silicon Valley-centric technologies and platforms to literally globalize and internationalize their ideology, bringing in other people to a movement that might have not been influenced in such a way had they not been exposed to this content through YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. This is not to say that the problem of white nationalism or neo-fascism or white supremacy is an exclusively American phenomenon or American-specific problem, but some of the strongest and best organized white supremacist groups are based in the United States, and they're internationalizing their ideologies and messages through these US-centric platforms. And so in Canada, of course, we're very much integrated with the United States at the level of technology, and Canadian-based hate movements are being inspired by these American sort of hate movements. So there's really strange cross-border sort of convergence whereby white supremacists in Canada and the United States will share organizing tactics, will share ideology, will sort of reaffirm the purpose and cause of their movement simply by connecting on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. So it's a kind of cross-border convergence or a strange kind of white nationalist internationalism that I think is unique to this day and age.
Where do you think the solution lies? You know, I heard an interview today on CBC Radio's Metro Morning with the Kevin Chan of Facebook. He's the Ottawa-based head of Facebook in Canada, talking about how they're going to put all of this money into reining in what happens around the elections. And I thought, can you really? Like, isn't it just, haven't we lost this game already? I mean, is there a solution out there?
So I don't think there's one best way to counter the sort of rise of the white nationalist right on social media platforms, but there are many different tactics being developed, being experimented with, and then being assessed with regard to their efficacy. So I can mention a few of those just now. To counter the presence and growing popularity of white nationalist videos on YouTube, we could recommend the following. So we might work with YouTube to take down white nationalist videos that violates its community guidelines. We could also encourage YouTube to hire more full-time content moderators and video curators to flag and take down videos that violate its hate speech policy. We could also invite YouTube to develop, algorithms that automatically identify and remove video content that violates its hate speech policy. And we could also, even as individual users or as groups of users, come together to post counter-hate videos and counter-hate narratives in the comment sections of YouTube channels and shows that are being used by white nationalists. But these, I'd argue, are still operating with the framework of YouTube's business model and the sort of logic of the technological fix, the idea that for every social problem we have a technological solution. And so I think that the solutions to the problem being currently identified and advanced by Silicon Valley tech companies can have a positive role and can have some positive effects, but I don't think that in and of themselves they go far enough. But I think Canadians should start deliberating about how best to govern these digital media titans in accordance with our own values and with our own policy, regulatory, and legal frameworks. At present, these companies largely operate with the mindset of laissez-faire. They do not want to be regulated or touched by any national government's sovereign communication and media policy or regulatory framework. So they're doing things on their own, like saying our business model will be sufficient to solving the problem, or our new algorithms will solve the problem, to very much avoid or escape the possibility, as we see sort of emerging around the world, that these companies will be brought into the ambit of a country's sovereign communication media policy framework. Hate is a political and a social problem. YouTube's business model, algorithms, and content moderators are a limited fix. Democratically developed social media law, policy, and regulation that takes on the torrent of digital hate, represents the public interest, and is backed by diverse social movements might be a better way forward for Canada.